The jungle is louder than the gunfire. Cicadas scream in the canopy. Rotor blades thud somewhere beyond the trees. The air hangs thick, wet, heavy, suffocating, clinging to skin and cloth like a second uniform. Then the shooting starts, sharp, close, sudden. Australian soldiers drop into the mud as rounds snap through bamboo and splinter tree bark. Someone shouts contact left. Another voice screams for a medic. The patrol's formation collapses into chaos. And in the middle of it, a warrant officer already bleeding. He's been hit. No dramatic pause, no slow realization, just impact. He stumbles, catches himself against a tree trunk slick with humidity and forces air back into his lungs. His radio handset dangles against his chest. Static hisses. Orders crackle. The enemy is unseen, concealed in dense foliage only meters away. A soldier crawls toward him. "Sir, you're hit." He doesn't answer the question. Scans the perimeter instead. 2 men down on the right flank, one not moving, another pinned behind a fallen log. The jungle floor churned into mud by boots and panic. A helicopter circles somewhere above the canopy, close enough to hear, too far to see. Evacuation is possible. He presses his hand against his side. It comes away dark. "Sir, we need to pull you out." His reply is immediate, steady, controlled. "I'm not leaving them." Another burst of gunfire rips across the clearing. Leaves explode from branches overhead. The smell of cordite mixes with damp earth and sweat. Every breath tastes metallic. He moves, not away from the fire, toward it. He drags one wounded soldier behind thicker cover, ignoring the protest from his own body. He signals another section to shift position. His voice cuts through the panic, calm and precise. He is already wounded. He will be wounded again. And again. 27 times before this day ends. But right now, none of that matters. What matters is that 40 men are scattered through this jungle, and if command structure breaks, if fear overtakes training, the ambush will consume them. The radio crackles again. "Dust off inbound, prepare casualty for extraction." He grips the handset. "Negative." There's a pause on the other end. He repeats it. "Negative, not leaving them." Gunfire continues. Minutes stretch into something unrecognizable. Time doesn't move forward, it tightens. A young private watches him stagger but refuse to fall. Watches him move from position to position, bleeding but directing fire. Watches him physically lift a wounded man onto his shoulder and haul him through mud under incoming rounds. In that moment, the private doesn't see rank. He sees refusal. The helicopter dips lower, searching for a landing window. Still, he refuses evacuation. Because if he leaves, the line may fracture. If he leaves, someone else must assume control, possibly under fire, possibly unready. If he leaves, 40 men may not make it out. The jungle roars again, and in the middle of it stands a warrant officer who should not still be standing. The question is no longer whether he will survive. The question is how many others will, because he refuses to go. Cut to black, the paradox of endurance. The number comes first, 27. It is repeated in headlines, etched into citations, spoken in reverent tones at commemorations. 27 wounds, 40 men saved. The numbers feel mathematical, clean, heroic, but war is never clean, and numbers rarely explain the cost of what they measure. The image most people hold is simple: a wounded Australian warrant officer refusing evacuation, choosing instead to remain under fire until every one of his men is accounted for. It fits neatly into the language of valor. It satisfies the national appetite for stories of loyalty, grit, and unbreakable resolve. But beneath that clarity lies a harder question. Was it courage or defiance? In military doctrine, command is not symbolic, it is structural. A warrant officer is not just another rifle in the line, he is connective tissue. He carries institutional memory, battlefield discipline, cohesion. His survival is not personal, it is tactical. And yet on that day in the Vietnamese jungle, he refused evacuation after being critically wounded. Not once, not twice, 27 times. Doctrine would argue that a severely wounded leader becomes a liability. Blood loss impairs judgment, pain narrows awareness, shock distorts perception. A compromised commander can misread terrain, misjudge fire lanes, miscalculate risk. Leadership in combat demands clarity, but leadership also demands presence. And here lies the paradox. If he had boarded that helicopter, if he had allowed medics to extract him after the first or second wound, he might have preserved his own life more effectively. He might have ensured a smoother transition of command. He might have adhered perfectly to military procedure, but something else would have vanished from that jungle clearing. Authority. Not rank, authority. There is a difference. Rank is assigned. Authority is earned under pressure. The men pinned down in that ambush did not need a symbol. They needed certainty. They needed a figure who would not break when the perimeter tightened and ammunition ran thin. They needed someone who would absorb fear instead of reflecting it. When he said, "I'm not leaving them," he was not simply rejecting evacuation. He was redefining leadership in that moment. Yet even that interpretation is complicated. Modern military ethics wrestle with this kind of decision. Heroism is not automatically strategic. There is a thin, dangerous line between inspiration and recklessness. What if he had collapsed? What if the cumulative damage of those wounds had rendered him unconscious in the middle of the fight? What if his refusal to leave had delayed extraction for others? What if his example had encouraged younger soldiers to ignore medical advice in future engagements? Every act of battlefield heroism carries potential ripple effects. Institutions cannot function on exceptionalism alone. And yet war is shaped by individuals who refuse ordinary limits. This documentary does not exist simply to celebrate endurance. It exists to examine it. Because this story forces a deeper question. At what point does duty to one's men override duty to one's own survival? And even more unsettling, is a soldier's life his own to preserve, or is it pledged entirely to those beside him? In counterinsurgency warfare, especially in the jungles of Vietnam, command structures were fragile. Dense terrain fractured visibility. Communication lines were unreliable. Ambushes erupted at close range, where seconds determined survival. In such environments, leadership was not exercised from behind sandbags or reinforced bunkers. It was exercised at arm's length, shouted over gunfire, enforced through example. The warrant officer understood this terrain. He understood that extraction of senior leadership mid-engagement could destabilize the fragile equilibrium holding the patrol together. But he also understood the physical reality of his injuries. 27 wounds is not a poetic exaggeration. It is cumulative trauma, shrapnel tearing muscle, bullets grazing flesh, fragmentation embedding beneath skin, blood loss that would normally mandate immediate evacuation. The human body has limits. The military has protocols for those limits. He crossed both. The public narrative often frames such acts as inevitable, as if some men are simply wired for superhuman endurance. But endurance is not mystical. It is a decision repeated under pressure. Each time he was struck, he could have changed course. Each time a medic reached for him, he could have nodded. Each time the helicopter's rotor wash pushed through the canopy, he could have stepped forward. Instead, he chose to remain. And that choice is what makes this story matter. Because it reveals the tension between two legitimate values: preserve the leader, protect the men. In textbooks, the answer is procedural. In the jungle, the answer was personal. There is another layer to this paradox, one rarely discussed. Hero narratives are comforting. They offer clarity. They reassure nations that courage is decisive and sacrifice is rewarded. But what about the cost borne by the individual long after the firefight ends? Survival under extreme injury is not a clean victory. The body remembers. The nervous system remembers. The scars do not fade simply because medals are awarded. If leadership demands self-sacrifice, how much sacrifice is too much? Was his refusal to leave an act of pure loyalty, or was it shaped by an internal code so absolute that retreat, even medical retreat, felt impossible? Soldiers are trained to move toward danger. They are conditioned to suppress pain, to subordinate self-interest to unit survival. That conditioning is essential in combat, but it also complicates consent. Did he choose freely, or did training make any other choice unthinkable? These are not accusations, they are questions, and this documentary will not rush to answer them. Instead, it will trace the layers, the institutional framework of the Vietnam War, the tactical realities of jungle ambush, the culture of Australian military leadership, the psychology of battlefield responsibility, and the human being at the center not as myth but as man. Because the most unsettling truth may be this: his decision was both heroic and dangerous. It saved 40 men, it nearly killed him, it strengthened morale, it strained doctrine, it embodied everything the military praises and challenged everything it regulates. The paradox of endurance is not about pain tolerance, it is about moral calculation under fire. And as we move deeper into this story, one question will guide us. When the moment came, when blood soaked into the jungle floor and the helicopter hovered overhead, was staying the only option he could live with? Or was leaving the one option he could not? The jungle will answer part of that. The institution will answer another. But the final answer belongs to the man who said without hesitation, "I'm not leaving them," and meant it. The war that shaped the moment, before the ambush, before the wounds, before the sentence that would define him. There was a war already fraying at its edges. By the mid-1960s, Vietnam was no longer a distant Cold War flashpoint. It had become a proving ground for competing doctrines, political resolve, and modern counterinsurgency theory. For Australia, involvement was not accidental. It was strategic, anchored in alliance commitments, regional security concerns, and the belief that communism spread in Southeast Asia posed a direct threat to national stability. Australia's military presence in Vietnam was smaller than America's, but it was deliberate. Highly trained units were deployed into Phuoc Thai province, tasked not with sweeping invasions, but with controlled, patrol-based counterinsurgency operations. This was not a conventional battlefield. There were no front lines, no fixed enemy formations, no predictable engagements. Instead, the war unfolded in fragments, ambushes, patrol contacts, sudden bursts of violence inside terrain that swallowed visibility. The jungle was not backdrop, it was a weapon. Dense canopy blocked aerial reconnaissance. Underbrush absorbed sound. Visibility narrowed to meters. Soldiers operated in small units, stretched thin across hostile ground, dependent on discipline and cohesion to survive. Australian doctrine emphasized professionalism over firepower. Where American forces often relied on overwhelming artillery and large-scale search and destroy missions, Australian units leaned into smaller patrols, careful movement, and deliberate engagement. The philosophy was clear: move quietly, observe patiently, strike decisively. But philosophy rarely survives first contact intact. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces understood terrain intimately. They selected engagement zones carefully: narrow clearings, choke points, natural kill boxes. Ambushes were designed not just to inflict casualties, but to fracture command structure. In jungle warfare, confusion is contagious. If the first seconds of contact disrupt leadership, panic spreads faster than gunfire. That is why rank mattered. That is why experience mattered. And that is why a warrant officer's presence was more than symbolic. Warrant officers in the Australian Army occupied a unique space. They were not junior officers learning command, nor were they distant strategists removed from frontline friction. They were technical leaders, deeply experienced, intimately familiar with both doctrine and ground reality. They were stabilizers. In Vietnam, stability was everything. Communication in dense jungle was unreliable. Radios crackled in and out. Extraction depended on clearing landing zones that might not exist. Helicopter support could be delayed by weather, visibility, or enemy fire. Evacuation was not guaranteed. Every patrol operated with the knowledge that if things collapsed, help might not arrive quickly enough. And this was the strategic reality surrounding the ambush that would define this story. Counterinsurgency doctrine emphasized preservation of command. If a senior leader was incapacitated, immediate evacuation was not only for medical survival, it was for continuity. Leadership needed to remain functional, coordinated, sharp, but doctrine assumes predictability. Jungle warfare offered none. Engagement distances were often close enough to see the whites of an enemy's eyes. Firefights erupted in seconds. There was rarely time for layered decision-making. Leadership became tactile, shouted orders, hand signals, physical repositioning of men under fire. And within that compressed chaos, leadership could not be abstract. It had to be visible. There is another strategic dimension often overlooked: morale. In counterinsurgency operations, morale was as decisive as ammunition. Soldiers walked long patrols through terrain that felt perpetually hostile. Fatigue accumulated. Trust in leadership determined whether discipline held under pressure. When an ambush struck, soldiers looked instinctively toward the most experienced figure present, not for speeches, for steadiness. The warrant officer understood this culture. He had trained inside it. He had operated within its assumptions. He knew that the first 30 seconds of an ambush often dictated the next 30 minutes. And in that opening moment, when he was first wounded, doctrine would have supported immediate extraction. But extraction in a jungle firefight was never clean. Landing zones had to be secured, perimeters stabilized, suppressive fire coordinated. If command fractured mid-process, evacuation could compound chaos. This is the strategic tension. Modern military institutions function on layered contingency planning. Roles are defined, successors designated, procedures rehearsed. But on the ground, succession under fire is rarely seamless. The ambush that day did not unfold in ideal conditions. Visibility was limited. Enemy positions were concealed. Casualties mounted quickly. The warrant officer's decision to remain was not made in a vacuum. It was shaped by the broader war environment, a conflict where small unit cohesion determined survival more than distant strategy. In Vietnam, Australian units prided themselves on adaptability. They emphasized initiative. Junior leaders were expected to think independently, to respond dynamically when plans disintegrated. This created a culture that valued judgment over rigid adherence. And yet, even in adaptable systems, physical limits matter. 27 wounds push beyond operational tolerance. Strategically, his survival was statistically unlikely. Tactically, his continued presence provided immediate coherence. This chapter is not about battlefield heroism. It is about environment, because environment shapes decision. The war in Vietnam was not mechanized maneuver across open plains. It was intimate, humid, disorienting combat where seconds collapsed into instinct. It was a war where doctrine collided with terrain daily. And it was inside that collision between institutional planning and jungle unpredictability that his defining moment emerged. Had this ambush occurred in open desert, with clear lines of sight and immediate armored support, the calculus might have been different. Had extraction been guaranteed within minutes, procedure might have prevailed. But in dense jungle, with men scattered and enemy concealed, leadership was not theoretical. It was embodied. And when he chose to stay, he was not rejecting strategy. He was responding to it as it existed in that exact clearing, in that exact moment, under that exact canopy. The broader war framed the stakes. The jungle framed the decision. And in that frame, the paradox deepened. Doctrine demanded preservation. Reality demanded presence. As we move forward, we leave the strategic map behind and step closer to the man who would test both. Because wars create conditions. But individuals decide how to endure them. The making of a warrant officer, before the jungle, before the ambush, before the sentence that would echo through decades. There was a boy in Australia who learned early that responsibility is not optional. He did not grow up imagining citations or decorations. He grew up in a country shaped by distance, vast landscapes, small communities, a culture that prized understatement over spectacle. In that environment, resilience was not dramatic. It was quiet, expected. The men who influenced him most did not speak in grand philosophies. They spoke in standards: show up, do the job, don't let others carry what you can carry yourself. When he enlisted, it was not for glory. It was for structure, for belonging, for purpose. The Australian Army of that era valued discipline without arrogance. Training was demanding, but it emphasized competence over theatrics. Drill was repetition. Fieldcraft was survival. Initiative was encouraged, but only after fundamentals were mastered. He absorbed it all, not loudly, not flamboyantly, methodically. What distinguished him early was not aggression, it was steadiness. He did not rush decisions. He did not waste words. He had a way of scanning a situation fully before speaking, a habit that in combat would become decisive. As he rose through the ranks, one defining skill set him apart: situational control under stress. Some soldiers freeze when plans collapse. Others overreact. He recalibrated. When radios failed, he defaulted to hand signals. When formations broke, he reassembled them instinctively. When younger soldiers panicked, he narrowed the problem to one clear instruction at a time. Control did not mean dominance. It meant containment. And in jungle warfare, containment of chaos is survival. By the time he became a warrant officer, he occupied a role that cannot be easily explained to civilians. He was not a distant strategist. He was not merely an experienced rifleman. He was the anchor point. Warrant officers are institutional memory embodied. They understand doctrine deeply enough to adapt it. They bridge officers and enlisted soldiers. They carry authority earned through repetition, not ceremony. But skill alone does not define leadership. His defining personality trait was refusal, not of orders, but of abandonment. He did not tolerate leaving tasks unfinished. He did not tolerate cutting corners. And most of all, he did not tolerate leaving men unsupported. This was not sentimental, it was structural. In his mind, cohesion was sacred. A unit functioned as a single organism. If one element was exposed, the entire body weakened. That belief would later harden into something absolute. Around him, the supporting cast of this story took shape. The young private, barely out of training, who watched him closely during patrol briefings. For that private, the warrant officer was not just rank. He was reassurance. A proof that someone experienced stood between him and disaster. The commanding officer, pragmatic, procedural, who trusted the warrant officer's ground instincts but expected adherence to doctrine when necessary. And the medic, practical, unromantic, trained to assess bodies as systems, to prioritize survival through extraction, to intervene when bravado endangered life. Each of these perspectives would converge in the jungle. Each would interpret his actions differently. Before deployment to Vietnam, he trained in environments that simulated stress but never fully replicated it. Live fire exercises, jungle movement drills, casualty simulations. Training builds reflex, but it does not fully build consequence. In Vietnam, consequence was immediate. He had already seen contact before the ambush that defined this story, already navigated patrol tensions, already witnessed how quickly jungle quiet could fracture into violence, and with each patrol his reputation solidified, not as reckless, not as flamboyant, but as immovable. When he spoke, soldiers listened not because of volume but because of consistency. He did not panic in minor engagements. He did not inflate threats. He did not minimize danger either. He described reality precisely. That precision built trust, and trust is oxygen in small unit warfare. There is an important nuance here. He was not fearless. No effective soldier is. Fear sharpens awareness. It forces calculation. What separates leaders under fire is not absence of fear. It is the ability to act through it without transmitting it outward. He internalized anxiety. He externalized control. That difference matters, because when the ambush came, when the first rounds cracked through foliage and the first casualty fell, soldiers would not have time to analyze doctrine. They would look to him, and what they saw would shape their own reactions. There is another layer to his personality rarely acknowledged in heroic narratives: stubbornness. The same trait that makes someone dependable can also make them inflexible. Refusal to abandon men is noble. Refusal to withdraw when necessary can be catastrophic. Before Vietnam, that stubbornness had never collided with a situation that tested its outer limit. In training exercises, safety nets existed. In smaller contacts, extraction was viable before cumulative injury set in. But the jungle ambush would compress time and injury into a single escalating spiral. The man who entered that jungle clearing was shaped by upbringing, by training, by institutional culture, and by personal code. He believed leadership required proximity. He believed responsibility did not diminish when wounded. He believed that the presence of command mattered as much as the mechanics of command. These beliefs were not theoretical. They were ingrained. And when the moment arrived, when medics reached for him, when helicopters circled overhead, he did not debate philosophy. He acted according to identity. This chapter is not about myth-making. It is about architecture. The architecture of a man built from discipline, steadiness, refusal, and proximity-based leadership. Because when we return to that jungle clearing and the choice appears, leave or stay, it will not feel sudden. It will feel inevitable. Not because heroism demands inevitability, but because character does. And in war, character is tested in increments, until one day it is tested all at once. Evidence cycle I, the first wound. The ambush did not begin as legend. It began as noise. A patrol moving through dense Vietnamese jungle, disciplined spacing, controlled pace, rifles angled toward uncertainty. The humidity pressed down like weight. Visibility was fractured by layers of green. Then contact, not distant artillery, not a warning shot, immediate close-range fire. The first seconds of an ambush determine everything. Training compresses into instinct. Soldiers dive for cover. Return fire seeks muzzle flashes through foliage. The jungle becomes a maze of echoes. In that first chaotic exchange, the warrant officer was hit. Not dramatically, not in a way that dropped him instantly, but enough to tear flesh and send shock through muscle. A bullet or fragment ripped into his body. Pain arrived fast, hot, electric. The correct response procedurally was clear. Assess wound, stabilize, evacuate if compromised. Instead, he assessed the perimeter. 2 men down on the left flank, 1 exposed, another screaming for a medic. His injury was secondary. That prioritization seems obvious in hindsight. Leaders often focus outward before inward, but combat medicine operates on different logic. A wounded commander is not merely a patient, he is a potential destabilizer. If he collapses later unexpectedly, chaos multiplies. The medic reached him. "You're hit, we need to move you." He shook his head, not dismissively, not theatrically, calmly. "Stabilize them first." That was the first deviation from protocol. Minor, perhaps, but deviation nonetheless. He remained upright. Blood seeped into fabric. He shifted positions to gain better visibility, issuing orders that cut through noise. "Shift right, 2 meters. Cover that tree line. Short bursts, conserve." The tactical picture in those first minutes was fragile. The patrol had been caught in a likely kill zone, enemy concealed, angles unclear, extraction not immediately viable. In similar engagements during the Vietnam War, casualty rates in initial ambushes could spike rapidly. Surprise eroded coordination. Units fractured under sustained fire. Statistically, early leadership stabilization significantly increased survival probability in small unit jungle engagements. A functioning command voice reduced panic-based exposure and improved controlled return fire. He understood this intuitively. Even wounded. The first wound could have justified removal, but he calculated differently. If he left now, Transition of command would occur mid-chaos. The junior leader assuming control would inherit incomplete information under fire. Seconds of confusion could cost lives, so he remained. Minutes stretched. Gunfire intensified. He moved toward one of the wounded soldiers, crawling through mud, pulling the man behind thicker cover. The motion reopened his own injury. Blood loss increased. Still, he stayed operational. The tactical result of those first 15 minutes was subtle but decisive. The perimeter did not collapse. Return fire became organized. Fields of fire were established instead of reactive spraying. The patrol did not disintegrate into individual survival attempts. Casualties remained contained rather than compounding. In many ambush scenarios of that era, breakdown of formation in the first 5 minutes often doubled fatality rates. Soldiers who moved independently were more vulnerable to crossfire. Panic amplified exposure. That did not happen here. Not yet. But institutional discomfort began to surface. The medic persisted. "You can't stay like this." He responded without raising his voice. "I'm fine." He was not fine. The human body does not negotiate with blood loss indefinitely. But leadership under fire is not assessed solely by medical metrics. It is assessed by coherence, and coherence was holding. Here lies the moral friction in this first evidence cycle. At what point does personal injury override command necessity? Military doctrine exists to protect both individual life and mission integrity. A wounded leader who refuses evacuation risks both, but evacuation itself introduces risk. Helicopter extraction requires securing a landing zone. Suppressive fire must be maintained. Movement patterns shift to protect the aircraft. Enemy fire often intensifies during attempted evacuation. Removing him early could have escalated vulnerability. Keeping him present risked long-term collapse if he deteriorated suddenly. He chose presence. The tension escalated when he sustained a second and third wound during the continued exchange. Fragmentation tore through his arm. A graze cut across his side. The number was still small, 3 wounds, enough to justify removal by strict standard, not enough in his mind to abandon position. The young private watching him later described the moment differently. He did not count wounds. He noticed posture. He didn't crouch lower, the private would recall years later. He didn't look scared, he just kept moving. Perception matters. In combat, soldiers often mirror visible leadership cues. If the most experienced figure remains upright, others interpret the situation as survivable. If that figure falls or withdraws early, uncertainty multiplies. The moral reaction within the unit was divided but silent. No one openly challenged his decision in that moment. Deference to experience outweighed procedural debate, but the medic's concern was not theatrical, it was practical. Unchecked blood loss leads to shock, shock leads to confusion. Confusion in a firefight leads to fatal mistakes. This first cycle is not yet mythic, it is tense. Manageable, balanced on edge, the ambush has not peaked. The cumulative damage has not yet reached double digits, but the pattern is forming. Injury, refusal, stabilization. Each repetition strengthens morale. Each repetition increases risk. By the end of this first phase, the patrol had regained enough control to prevent immediate overrun. Casualties were still mounting, but not catastrophically, and he was still standing. The paradox tightens here. His continued presence improved tactical coherence. His accumulating wounds threatened eventual collapse. The first wound did not define him. It defined his threshold, and the threshold was higher than doctrine anticipated. But thresholds, once crossed, rarely retreat. The jungle was not finished. Neither was the escalation, because the next phase would force him beyond manageable deviation into something far more dangerous. Evidence cycle II, the extraction under fire. By the time the second phase of the ambush unfolded, the jungle had shifted. The initial shock was gone. Now it was sustained pressure. Enemy fire intensified from multiple angles, suggesting coordinated positioning. What began as a single kill zone widened into overlapping arcs. The patrol was no longer reacting, it was being tested. And he was hit again. Not a grazing strike this time. Fragmentation tore into his torso as he repositioned to reinforce the right flank. The impact drove air from his lungs. For a moment, brief but measurable, his knees weakened. This was the inflection point. Double-digit injuries were no longer hypothetical. The body was accumulating trauma faster than field dressings could compensate. The medic's voice sharpened. "You're done, we're pulling you out." The helicopter's rotor wash could now be heard more distinctly through the canopy. Extraction was becoming tactically viable if the perimeter held, but extraction required focus, and focus required leadership. The paradox deepened. If he stepped toward the landing zone, others would need to shift attention to cover him. Fire discipline might fracture. The enemy, sensing movement, could press harder. If he stayed, he risked systemic failure, his own. He made a choice again. He stayed. But this time the stakes expanded beyond his own injury. 2 soldiers were pinned forward of the main defensive line, exposed, wounded, unable to crawl back under sustained fire. Leaving them meant likely death. Attempting retrieval meant crossing open ground. In small unit jungle engagements during Vietnam, exposed casualty retrieval often accounted for secondary injuries. Statistically, the act of rescue itself increased risk to rescuers by measurable margins. He understood that, and moved anyway, not in reckless sprint but in calculated bursts. He directed suppressive fire from 2 positions before advancing. He timed movement between enemy volleys. He dropped beside the first wounded soldier, dragging him behind partial cover while rounds struck the earth nearby. A fragment struck him again. The count climbed. He did not acknowledge it. He did not pause. The second soldier was heavier, unconscious. Movement required lifting. At this stage, cumulative blood loss begins to impair strength. Muscle response slows, peripheral vision narrows. Yet witnesses would later describe his voice as unchanged, steady, controlled. Cover left. Shift fire. Move now. He hauled the second man back into the perimeter. This altered the tactical picture significantly. Casualty survival rates in ambush scenarios often hinge on retrieval speed. Delayed extraction increases mortality sharply, particularly in jungle environments where infection risk and hemorrhage escalate quickly. By physically securing those 2 men under fire, he did more than inspire. He changed outcomes. The perimeter solidified further. The helicopter pilot, monitoring from above, later reported hesitation to descend earlier due to unstable fire lanes. The retrieval and reorganization reduced chaos enough to make landing or hover extraction more feasible, but he still refused evacuation for himself. The medic escalated tone. "You're losing too much blood." His response was not defiant. It was dismissive of the premise. "Not yet." This phrase reveals something critical. He was not denying injury. He was sequencing priority. His survival was conditional. Theirs was immediate. The institutional reaction to such decisions is layered. On one hand, battlefield valor citations often emphasize exactly this behavior: selfless risk, personal exposure, refusal to abandon wounded. On the other, modern doctrine discourages cumulative self-endangerment by senior leadership. Redundancy in command exists for a reason. If he collapsed mid-operation, the vacuum could destabilize everything he had stabilized. This was no longer a single deviation from protocol. It was a pattern. The number of wounds climbed into double digits, shrapnel embedded in muscle. Lacerations reopened with movement. Uniform saturated. Still, he coordinated defensive arcs, ensured ammunition redistribution, and repositioned soldiers into more defensible micro-terrain. In comparable Vietnam ambushes of similar scale, casualty rates often rose sharply once leadership disruption occurred. Here, despite sustained contact, Fatality numbers remained lower than projected averages for sudden multi-angle engagements. Correlation is not causation, but presence matters. The young private from earlier would later describe watching him cross open ground and thinking something irreversible. If he's still moving, we can't stop. That is the psychological multiplier. Not hero worship. Momentum. Momentum prevents paralysis, but momentum also accelerates cost. By the midpoint of this engagement, the count of his injuries approached numbers that would normally render a soldier non-operational. Shock was imminent. The medic prepared morphine, hesitating. Administering it might dull pain but impair cognition. Withholding it preserved clarity but prolonged suffering. He chose clarity. Pain remained sharp. The helicopter finally dipped low enough for partial casualty extraction. Several wounded soldiers were loaded during a brief window of suppressed enemy fire. He refused to board. Again. Now the moral tension within the unit intensified. Some saw his refusal as necessary. Others saw the accumulating toll and feared what would happen if he fell suddenly. Leadership can inspire. It can also intimidate dissent. No one forced him onto that aircraft. No one relieved him of command. The battle continued. The jungle grew quieter in intervals, then erupted again. Ammunition ran low. Repositioning became more difficult as fatigue set in, and through it all he remained at the center. The second evidence cycle reveals something distinct from the first. The first wound established threshold. The second phase tested sustainability. He was no longer simply stabilizing an ambush. He was absorbing it, and absorption has limits. The paradox sharpens here. His actions were tactically effective. They were statistically influential. They were psychologically transformative. They were medically unsustainable. The count was still rising, and the jungle had not yet reached its final escalation. The question was no longer whether he would leave. The question was how much more he could endure before endurance itself became the greatest threat. Because in the next phase, survival would demand something beyond discipline. It would demand sacrifice at scale. Evidence cycle III 27. By now, the jungle no longer felt chaotic, it felt compressed. The firefight had stretched long enough for adrenaline to burn into exhaustion. The initial violence had settled into grinding exchanges, bursts of gunfire, movement, silence, then eruption again. And he was still there, still issuing orders, still moving, still bleeding. The count had passed what anyone would consider survivable in ordinary terms. Shrapnel had embedded across his torso and limbs. Bullets had grazed and torn. Uniform fabric clung to him, heavy and dark. The medic stopped counting aloud, but internally he knew. This was no longer a question of bravery. It was a question of how long the body could defy collapse. The enemy adjusted tactics. Fire shifted toward suppressing the center of the perimeter, probing for weakness. They sensed resistance holding. They pressed harder. 2 more soldiers were struck in quick succession near the left arc. One cried out. The other went silent. The warrant officer pivoted immediately. He should not have been able to move as quickly as he did. Cumulative trauma affects balance. Blood loss narrows cognition. Peripheral awareness fades. Yet witnesses later described something uncanny, not invincibility but refusal to acknowledge physical surrender. He crawled first, then rose to one knee, then surged forward between volleys. Another impact struck him mid-movement. The count climbed again. He did not fall. He reached the wounded pair and began the process again, dragging, repositioning, directing suppressive fire with gestures rather than full voice now. The shift is subtle but important. His speech shortened. Orders became fewer words. Energy conservation. Pain was no longer something he could suppress fully. It was something he managed in fragments. This third phase is where escalation becomes mythic in hindsight, but in real time it was grinding, physical, incremental. There was no cinematic music, only insects, gunfire, breathing. The helicopter returned, attempting a second extraction window. Smoke was deployed to mark position. For a moment, the jungle filled with rotor, thunder, and dust. Several more wounded were loaded. Again, he was ordered toward the aircraft. This time, the order carried more weight. His injuries were visible, undeniable. The medic nearly overrode him, but he refused, not angrily, not loudly, just definitively. Get them out. By now, some soldiers began to understand what was happening beyond tactics. He was anchoring the perimeter through sheer will. Every time the helicopter lifted with another wounded man aboard, the remaining soldiers recalibrated hope. Casualty survival probability was rising. Incomparable ambush engagements of similar duration during the Vietnam War, sustained contact often resulted in significantly higher fatality rates once wounded could not be evacuated quickly. Here, extraction was occurring in phases. 40 men would eventually leave that jungle alive. That number is not coincidence. It is the result of decisions made under extreme degradation, but effectiveness carried cost. His movement slowed further. A tremor appeared in his hands when reaching for the radio. Shock loomed close. The medic later described watching for signs: glassy eyes, delayed responses, disorientation. They did not come fully. Not yet. Instead, something else emerged, a kind of narrowing. His world reduced to tasks: left flank secure, right arc covering, wounded accounted for, ammunition redistributed. The firefight did not end suddenly. It tapered. Enemy fire diminished gradually, whether due to ammunition depletion, repositioning, or calculation that the ambush had failed to collapse the unit. Silence did not feel victorious. It felt fragile. Smoke hung low between trees. The wounded were consolidated, and only then did the full physical reality become visible. He swayed. 27 wounds, 27 distinct penetrations of flesh, some superficial, some severe, all cumulative. Statistically, survival after such compounded trauma in jungle conditions was improbable, and yet he remained conscious long enough to ensure final accountability. Count them. The words were barely above breath. Names were called. Responses came back shaken, exhausted, alive. 40 men, alive. Only after confirmation did he allow himself to be moved, not because he changed his mind, but because the objective in his mind was complete. The helicopter lifted him last. The third evidence cycle proves both sides of the paradox simultaneously. Effectiveness, perimeter stabilized, multiple casualty retrieval successful, survival rate dramatically higher than comparable engagements, morale preserved under sustained fire, cost, extreme physical trauma, long-term medical consequences, institutional discomfort over deviation from evacuation protocol, psychological burden of prolonged exposure to near death. Some in command would later frame his actions as the gold standard of leadership under fire. Others would quietly note that such endurance cannot be institutionalized, it cannot be mandated, it cannot be safely replicated. Heroism at that scale resists policy. The young private years later would describe the moment the helicopter carried him away. He looked smaller, he said. Like once the fight stopped, everything hit him at once. That detail matters. Because during the firefight, he was not operating as an individual body. He was operating as function. Once function ended, biology reclaimed its due. 27 wounds, 40 men. The numbers are clean, the experience was not. This third cycle completes the escalation. There is no further endurance to test, no higher number to climb, only the aftermath. And within that aftermath lies the defining decision, not the movement under fire, not the retrieval, not even the refusal. But the moment when evacuation was possible early, and he said no. Because now that the jungle is quiet, we can isolate that instant, the binary choice. Leave and preserve himself, or stay and preserve them. The climax is not the accumulation of wounds. It is the moment the first helicopter hovered overhead, and he chose against it. That is where we go next. The decision: I'm not leaving them. Strip away the gunfire. Strip away the numbers. Strip away the mythology that would come later. The defining moment was not wound number 27. It was wound number 1, because that was when the helicopter first hovered close enough to matter. Rotor wash pressed the jungle canopy downward. Leaves shuddered. Smoke drifted sideways. A brief corridor of possibility opened above the clearing. Evacuation was real, not theoretical, not delayed. Real. The medic grabbed his shoulder. "Sir, this is your window." It is important to understand what that window represented. Medical extraction in Vietnam was not guaranteed twice. Landing zones could collapse under renewed fire. Aircraft could be forced away. Opportunities vanished quickly. If he boarded then early, he would likely survive with fewer complications. Blood loss would be contained sooner. Infection risk reduced. Long-term damage minimized. Procedure supported this choice. Logic supported this choice. Self-preservation supported this choice. And yet he refused. This is the binary moment, not dramatic, not shouted, simply decided, "I'm not leaving them." The helicopter circled once, waiting for final confirmation. He did not move. From a distance, this could be interpreted as stubborn pride, a leader unwilling to appear weak, a senior figure protecting reputation. But those who were there described something different. He was scanning the perimeter. 2 men were still exposed. One flank had not fully stabilized. Command transition mid-engagement risked hesitation, even a few seconds of it. He was not thinking about metals. He was thinking about fracture. If he left before containment, the structure he had built in those first seconds could unravel. Leadership in combat is often less about issuing orders and more about absorbing fear. The moment a leader is seen evacuating under fire, perception shifts. Rationally, soldiers understand injury. Emotionally, withdrawal signals vulnerability. In that clearing, perception was survival. The internal conflict here is essential. He knew he was wounded. He could feel blood pooling in fabric. Pain was sharp and immediate. He was not delusional. He understood the risk of staying. He also understood the cost of leaving. In military ethics, this is the tension between role, responsibility, and personal preservation. A commander has duty to mission. A commander also has duty to self because the institution has invested in that leader's experience. If he died in that jungle, the loss would extend beyond the patrol. It would impact future operations, training pipelines, institutional memory. His life had strategic value, and yet in that moment strategic value felt abstract. 40 men felt immediate. There is a phrase often used in combat leadership: last man out. It is cultural, not doctrinal. It carries symbolic weight. Leaders are expected to ensure their men withdraw safely before themselves, but that expectation rarely intersects with catastrophic injury. The difference here is scale. He was not slightly wounded. He was accumulating trauma rapidly. Every minute of refusal compounded risk. The medic pressed again. "You're not going to make it if you stay." That sentence is critical because this was no longer about discomfort. It was about probability of death. He looked at the helicopter, then at his men, then back to the tree line where fire still flickered. The choice condensed into something almost primal. Leave and live but risk cohesion. Stay and possibly die but stabilize survival odds. There is no formula for this calculation, no algorithm, no handbook scenario identical enough to replicate. This is where doctrine ends and character begins. His defining skill, situational control under stress, now turned inward. He assessed, not emotionally, not theatrically, but in layers. Are the flanks secure? Are casualty retrievals complete? Is fire discipline holding? Is there a viable successor ready to assume immediate command? The answer at that moment was incomplete, and incomplete was unacceptable, so he refused again. The helicopter pulled away temporarily. The jungle reclaimed its noise. Gunfire resumed. In refusing early evacuation, he extended exposure to all subsequent wounds. This is the hidden truth of the climax. The 27 wounds are not random accumulation. They are the consequence of that first refusal. Had he boarded that helicopter at wound number 1, the story would end differently. 40 men might still have survived, or they might not. We cannot simulate the alternate outcome with certainty. What we can measure is what did happen. He remained. He coordinated. He retrieved. He absorbed. And by the time the firefight tapered, he had sustained injuries that under normal conditions would have removed any soldier from the battlefield multiple times over. The outcome proves effectiveness. 40 men extracted alive. The cost proves reality. Long surgeries, extended recovery, permanent scars, possible lifelong pain. Psychological weight of knowing that survival hinged partly on his refusal to leave. This is where hero narratives simplify. They present the decision as inevitable, as though he had no choice but to stay. But he did have a choice. That is what makes it meaningful. He could have stepped toward the helicopter. No one would have judged him harshly. No one would have stripped rank or respect. He was already wounded, already proven, yet he stayed. And that staying is both the triumph and the tension of this story, because institutions cannot build doctrine on singular acts of defiance. They can honor them. They can commemorate them. But they cannot require them. The helicopter returned one final time, only when the perimeter was stable, only when the wounded were accounted for, only when his men were secured. Then and only then did he allow himself to be lifted out, not first, last. As the aircraft rose above the jungle, blood loss finally overtook momentum. The fight was over. The decision was complete. And history had its moment. But history rarely records the internal silence that follows. The quiet realization that survival was no longer guaranteed. The awareness that the body might fail long before the story becomes legend. The climax is not cinematic glory. It is a sentence spoken under rotor wash. I'm not leaving them. And the cost that sentence demanded. Next comes what happens when the adrenaline fades and institutions must interpret what one man chose. Immediate aftermath. When the helicopter lifted him out of the jungle, the war did not end. It simply changed form. Inside the aircraft, noise overwhelmed everything, rotor blades hammering the air, metal vibrating, the medic shouting vital signs over the roar. The jungle below shrank into a patchwork of green, and for the first time since the ambush began, he was no longer directing anything. He was a patient. The shift is abrupt in combat extraction. One moment you are issuing commands, the next you are horizontal, strapped to a stretcher, your body assessed in fragments. Entry wound. Exit wound. Embedded shrapnel, blood pressure falling. 27 wounds is a number for history books. In the helicopter it was a checklist. Bandage, tourniquet, pressure, reassess. Shock finally arrived. Adrenaline, which had masked the severity of his injuries for hours, began to recede. Tremors set in. Vision narrowed, speech slowed. He asked one question. How many? The medic understood. All accounted for. That answer mattered more than morphine. He was transported first to a forward medical facility, triage under controlled chaos. Doctors worked methodically. Some wounds were superficial, others required immediate surgical intervention. Fragmentation had penetrated deep muscle groups. Blood transfusions stabilized volume loss. The medical reality was stark. He should not have remained functional for as long as he did. Physicians would later describe his survival as statistically improbable given cumulative trauma and blood loss sustained in jungle conditions. But survival is not just physiology. It is timing. And his timing, refusing early evacuation, enduring prolonged exposure, had delayed his own treatment by choice. This is where institutional response begins to diverge. Public narrative formed quickly. Reports filtered up the chain of command. A warrant officer wounded multiple times, refusing evacuation, saving 40 men. Commendation paperwork began drafting almost immediately. Bravery under fire, leadership beyond expectation, selfless devotion to comrades, all accurate. But inside operational review rooms, a quieter discussion unfolded. Senior officers examined the sequence of decisions. When was he first wounded? When was evacuation possible? At what point did refusal increase systemic risk? This was not criticism. It was analysis. Military institutions cannot afford to rely on extraordinary individual endurance as policy. They must consider sustainability. If every leader refused evacuation after critical injury, casualty chains might expand unpredictably. Command succession protocols exist to prevent collapse when leaders fall. He had defied that protocol successfully. But success does not eliminate risk. Some within the institution framed his actions as the highest expression of leadership culture, proximity, loyalty, refusal to abandon. Others acknowledged that his survival hinged on rare variables: timing of helicopter windows, strength of subordinate discipline, enemy withdrawal patterns. It could have ended differently. Heroism often becomes visible only because it did not fail. Meanwhile, he moved through surgical theaters, metal removed, wounds cleaned, stitches layered across skin that would never look the same again. Recovery was not swift. Physical healing required weeks. Rehabilitation required months. Some injuries healed cleanly. Others lingered: nerve damage, stiffness, chronic pain that flared unpredictably. The body does not forget 27 penetrations. Psychologically, the aftermath is quieter and more complex. Combat intensity leaves residue. Sleep fractures. Silence feels unnatural after prolonged gunfire. He did not speak extensively about fear, but he did speak about responsibility. Visitors came: fellow soldiers, commanding officers, chaplains. Some called him hero. He dismissed the word. They would have done the same. That statement reveals something essential. In his mind, the decision was not exceptional. It was expected. That belief complicates public celebration, because if such endurance is framed as ordinary, it subtly raises the bar for others. Medals eventually followed. Recognition formalized. Ceremonies compressed chaos into citation language. Gallantry, courage, devotion beyond duty. But medals do not stitch muscle. They do not erase infection risk. They do not shorten rehabilitation. And they do not quiet internal replay of the firefight. Survivors' calculus emerges in aftermath. 40 men lived. Some were permanently wounded. Some carried psychological scars. He carried the knowledge that had he boarded that first helicopter, outcomes might have shifted, for better, for worse, unknowable. The young private visited him once during recovery. He stood awkwardly beside the hospital bed. "Sir, we made it." It was both gratitude and confirmation. And in that exchange, the story solidified not as myth, but as shared survival. Institutionally, his case became a teaching example, discussed in leadership seminars, cited in training narratives, debated in tactical reviews. What does effective leadership under catastrophic injury look like? When does refusal strengthen morale? When does it endanger continuity? No single answer emerged. Instead, his story became a benchmark, not for replication but for reflection. He eventually returned home, not to fanfare alone but to adjustment. Scars beneath uniform, pain behind posture, and the weight of having made a choice that would follow him the rest of his life. The immediate aftermath is often quieter than the firefight. No gunfire, no helicopters, just hospital corridors and internal reckoning. The jungle had demanded everything. Now the institution had to interpret what it had witnessed, and interpretation is never as simple as celebration. Next comes the longer arc: the man after war, not as symbol, as human being, the man after war. War compresses identity. You are rank, role, function. After war, those structures dissolve. He returned to Australia not as a myth, but as a man recovering from trauma most people could not see. The physical scars were visible: raised lines across skin, stiffness in movement, the occasional unconscious flinch when pain flared unexpectedly. But the deeper marks were quieter. Combat does not leave clean psychological edges. It lingers in fragments. Humidity in summer could bring back the jungle. The chop of distant helicopter blades could narrow his breathing. Long silences sometimes felt heavier than gunfire ever had. He did not frame his experience politically. He did not speak in grand statements about strategy or ideology. When asked about the day in the jungle, he often redirected. "It was the men," he would say. "They kept moving." In interviews later in life, his tone was steady, almost understated. He never exaggerated the number of wounds. He never dramatized the moment of refusal. He described it as responsibility. "They were mine," he said once, referring to the patrol. "You don't leave your men." There was no theatrical pause after that sentence, just conviction. But reflection over decades adds dimension. In quieter moments, he acknowledged something rarely captured in citations: fear. Not fear of death, fear of failing them. Fear that if he stepped toward that helicopter too early, the line would buckle. Fear that hesitation, even seconds of it, might cost lives. That fear, more than courage, shaped his decision. He resumed life beyond the battlefield: work, family, community. Yet veterans often carry dual existence: outwardly present, internally tethered to a moment in time. Some of the men he saved stayed in contact. Reunions brought shared silence more than storytelling. They did not need to recount every detail. They had inhabited it together. One of them once told him quietly, "If you had left, I don't know." That unfinished sentence lingered between them. Survival creates bonds that do not require completion. He never publicly framed his choice as sacrifice. He resisted that word. To him, sacrifice implied loss, and in his calculation, staying had preserved life. But privately, he understood cost: the long recovery, the permanent reminders etched into his body. The nights when memory replayed differently than ceremony described. His resolution was not political. He did not argue about the Vietnam War's broader strategy in interviews. He did not attempt to justify national policy. His resolution was personal. "I did what I thought was right in that moment." No broader claim, no universal prescription, just that. Over time, the story became larger than the man. Books referenced him. Training materials cited him. Younger soldiers learned his name before they understood the humidity of that jungle. He never fully embraced the myth. He accepted recognition, but he did not perform it, because the defining memory for him was not the medal. It was the roll call after the firefight. 40 voices answering, alive. And perhaps that is the clearest window into his internal resolution. He did not measure success by endurance of pain. He measured it by survival of others. The modern debate. Hero stories age. Interpretations evolve. In contemporary military ethics discussions, his decision sits at an uneasy intersection. On one side, advocates argue that leadership by example under extreme duress is irreplaceable. His refusal to evacuate preserved morale, stabilized a chaotic ambush, and demonstrably increased survival rates. In small unit warfare, presence matters more than protocol. They cite data showing that cohesive units under visible leadership maintain fire discipline longer and suffer fewer panic-driven casualties. They argue that doctrine must allow space for judgment. On the other side, critics caution against romanticizing exceptional endurance. Institutions cannot rely on superhuman resilience. If a senior leader sustains critical injury, evacuation preserves long-term operational capability. They ask, what if he had died in that clearing? What if shock had overtaken him mid-command? What precedent does such refusal set for younger leaders? They warn that glorifying defiance of evacuation protocol may unintentionally pressure others to ignore medical necessity in future engagements. Both positions are grounded, both are defensible. The tension remains unresolved, because war resists clean frameworks. Heroism can coexist with risk. Effectiveness can coexist with danger. The institution honored him, but it did not rewrite doctrine around him. And that balance reflects the paradox at the heart of this story. Final callback: return to the jungle, we return to the beginning. Humidity, gunfire, the helicopter hovering, the sentence, "I'm not leaving them." At first it sounded like defiance, then like loyalty, then like legend, but with depth it becomes something more complex. It was not a rejection of survival. It was a reordering of priority. He did not choose death. He chose responsibility at a cost that nearly equaled it. The jungle has long since grown over the clearing where that ambush took place. Leaves fell, soil shifted, time absorbed the noise, but the paradox remains. Leadership demands survival. Sometimes survival demands refusal. 27 wounds, 40 men. One decision, not perfect, not procedural, human, and costly, fade to black.